So welcome to the Node.js Technical Steering Committee meeting for January 15, 2020. We're going to follow the standard agenda, which was in the issue opened in the repo. To start, does anybody have any announcements or other things that they'd like to share? Okay, so if we have no announcements today, we'll move on to the CPC and board meeting updates. I guess the update I would have, we'd made a request for build resources. I did get a few names from Microsoft who I'm chasing down. Unfortunately, a couple of them, at least one of them, doesn't actually have cycles. So still pursuing that, but haven't gotten to the point where we're actually getting people engaged yet. I will take a quick look at the board. I don't think there's anything on it, but just to make sure, in the admin repo for things to be taken to the board. Where are we? Projects. And so I think that we've covered the ones that are there. The other thing I will mention, there's some discussion going around. This is sort of CPC related too, about the travel fund. In the meantime, we did get one travel fund request, so I've asked for, and there's underway a board vote to get approval as a one-off so that we can approve that travel, as well as you know, there is some discussion back and forth in terms of size of the fund for next year, and some concerns being expressed by a few TSC members. So if you know, it's something that you know, other people here may want to go and take a look at as well. On the CPC front, I guess the one thing I would call out is that there is going to be a sort of code of conduct team spun up to look at the current proposal and some of the suggestions, the additional sort of new suggestions that people have made in terms of, you know, scope and so forth, to try to plot the direction forward out of the discussion after the discussions at the Collaborator Summit. So that's something, if you're interested, you should look to get involved. And if you have any trouble finding that, let me know and we can get you hooked in. I think those are the main things I would call. Anybody else have anything on that front that they have questions on, or you know, other information to add? No? Okay, so let's move on to the issues which are tagged in the agenda. The first one is 31,000. Process add CLI to hide experimental warnings. We had a good discussion about that last week. And there was, I think, a direction suggested. Let me just see if anything more is there. So I think there were some suggestions. James had added his comment to the issue. So I think we can probably remove from the agenda unless anybody has alternate suggestions or thoughts.
I think we likely just forgot to remove it last week.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to remove it right now so that we don't forget again. Sorry, that will just take me a minute as I wait for GitHub to. Okay, next one is doc add run kit embeds, which is 3241. This one, I know there's been some discussion. Last time we did ask if we could get somebody from Run Kit to come and sort of have a discussion with us. sounds like the one of the people from RunKit is available to do that. They weren't available this week, but we're looking to try and do it next week. So I guess I'd propose, unless people have some things they want to talk about now, we might defer that till next week. Okay, sounds like we'll do that. So we'll defer that till next time. So the next one on the agenda is doc, add example for Cypher update 28373. Is anybody who's been active in that issue want to speak to that? The disagreement seems to be over whether we should pull in and have more, I guess, in this case, potentially duplicated examples in the crypto documentation.
Every single
Sorry, Sam,
individual
you're
API
completely breaking up.
Sam, you're completely breaking up.
Can you try again, or?
Yeah, am I at all audible or?
Yeah, that now you're better.
Yeah, okay. I personally think that having long form examples of the complete crypto cipher API underneath every single individual method makes the docs harder to read. I know other people don't feel that way. I think it's better to just link. Yeah, I mean the docs are already there. I don't think we need a complete crypto example underneath every single method. It doesn't make sense to me either. Tobias, do you have an opinion, or is this more of a doc thing than a crypto thing?
I think it's more of a doc thing, but I kind of agree with you. I also don't like the idea. Technically, you could put this kind of example under every single API that we have, and I'm not really a fan of that idea.
I guess it would make it quite long. Like the doc's pretty long if every API had its own example, right?
I know some people, there was a talk about this, I forget who it was at the summit, so I won't try and remember their name, but some people feel like there should be an example under every API. It just gets, but then there's people who also think that every example should be runnable standalone.
Right.
And on the face of it, both of those things sound reasonable, except a lot of our APIs, to get a standalone runnable example, you need a whole bunch of code around them that are not the API being demonstrated. So it's, I mean, for a simple math or a simple string method, that's a no-brainer, but for stuff as complicated as this, so I think there's a disagreement. Is there a doc working group anymore?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I'm not aware of like the team that actively gets together on that front. Could be wrong.
Right.
My understanding is I think there was a working group. I believe it was dechartered. Rich was more actively involved, but I don't believe it's an active effort anymore.
Yeah, that's okay. So what you're saying is this is more of a macro style thing necessarily than specific crypto APIs related, but
I'm looking at this specific one right now, and it seems like at the beginning of the Cypher class documentation, these particular examples are all already there. So it's just a couple of paragraphs above, and it doesn't seem to contain much new information, this example that's now added.
I'm not sure that the conversation really reached an end. I think the TSC got pulled in too quickly. It seems
Yep.
contentious, so people don't want to comment, I think, but
Yeah.
I'm just I'll comment on the PR, and I think it's partly sensitive because somebody was invited to make the change as a code and learn exercise.
Yep.
So it feels, unfriendly, and to then reject the change when we well, not any individual here, but as a group, they were somehow asked to make the change.
Yep.
And that's unfortunate, but I don't know if that's enough of a reason to land it.
I
Yeah.
agree with Rich and you, Sam, that this wasn't necessarily a good task for a code and learn event. I think Rich already commented that on the PR somewhere. That doc changes are not necessarily good for code and learns.
Yeah. I mean, I think especially as even if you said let's land that because of that, I don't think it should be a policy direction of like now everything has an example, and if we decide that the answer is no, then it could easily be removed. So yeah, it's not a good enough reason to set a direction that completely changes the docs. I mean. So I think, Sam, what you're suggesting is we let the discussion continue in the issue, right? And for people to chime in, asking TC members to chime in there. Is that fair?
That's what I would suggest, yeah.
Okay, that seems definitely reasonable to me as well. And anybody else have any more points to discuss on this one, or think we should continue discussing as opposed to pushing it back to GitHub? Okay, if not, let's move on to the next issue, which is async hooks. Introduce async storage API 26540. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk to this. I can talk to this one a bit, having looked at it. I'll take the silence as the okay to proceed. So this one is a PR to pull in CLS context, basically being able to have an API where you can help preserve context across async requests. It came out of a discussion at the Diagnostic Summit back in the fall. And the issue we were struggling with at the time is that async hooks isn't stable, and actually we're not convinced we have the right API, and we're making very slow, if any, progress on changing that. And so the discussion was that it might be easier to come up with a higher level API, because async hooks, some of the concerns are like, does it expose too much internals? Is it too specific to what's going on? And that's part of why we're concerned about taking it out of experimental. But a higher level API may not have those concerns. So an API that helps you preserve context, which is one of the key use cases in APMs and other modules for async hooks, might not have that problem, and so let's have a PR which adds that to core. And this is the PR which does that. In the issue itself, there's some objections, some discussion, and I think the three key questions in my mind are, one, should an API like this be in core or not? So some people have already chimed in, but unless we can make progress in the issue, we may need to have the TSC, say yes or no to that first question. The next discussion in the issue is around what the API should look like. There's actually two different PRs, and they really differ by naming. So one uses async context, the other one uses async local. Async local is kind of a tie back to thread locals, say in Java. And they're used more in that way, in that you just define one for each of the things you want to be local, versus the async context gives you a map you can get, and then in that map you can get and store data, which kind of comes down to the second main difference, which is what's the root data type. In async local, it can be any type. In async context, it's a map, although like, of course, in that map, you can put whatever you want into. So it's just one extra indirection. And then finally, the third main difference is that for async context in one of the PRs, you need to actually wrap things in a run. So you say like async context.run, and then, you know, the propagation and everything is managed for code within that context. In async local, there's no sort of scoping or definition of that. And, you know, I think part of the discussion around that is like, well, in existing CLS implementations, there is that context of run. And also I think in domains, which is, you know, potential use case for this context propagation, they've also used you know, some sort of context to scope it. So that's why the run would make sense. And then the third question is around, so that's what, you know, what should the API look like? And the third question is then, there's a PR out there which adds 30959, which adds async execution resource, and that will, you know, allow a better implementation of any of these PRs. And do we need to wait for that to land or not? I think the main concern, you know, with waiting might be is that right now there's some performance issues with that, so it's not clear how long it will take to get that landed. And if it's not going to affect the actual external API, it may not need to be a blocker. If, you know, the experimental API that this adds doesn't need to change when that comes in, it just gets better. Does it, you know, do we need to link the two together or not? So that's my summary of the three things that I think the TSC likely is going to need to weigh in on. Just interested in people's thoughts. Have these people had it? Have we had a chance to look at it, and sort of what's our next step in trying to answer those questions?
Would the async storage API have to live in core?
That's the first question, right? Like, do we think it lives in core? The, you know, the discussion around why that makes sense is that, you know, one comment I think Sam made is that it will actually make it easier to get modules in line with supporting it properly. It's also fairly fundamental. Like, in my mind, it's something which is important enough that it should be in core, at least in my opinion. So I don't know what other people want to jump in on that discussion.
Okay, but there's no technical reason it would have to be in core.
In terms, no, I mean that there are implementations, although they're like, there's external implementations. I wouldn't say that people are happy necessarily with them, like those being external. Like, even, you know, so the maintainers of those external ones would be very happy if it was something that was more tightly integrated. But I don't think technically there's something that says that. The difference is that like an external module would have to depend on async hooks or do monkey patching today. And we don't really want to make the async hook something non-experimental. So you may not get to a non-experimental feature that way, if you know what I mean. Whereas a higher level API, we might actually be able to make non-experimental, even though, you know, we don't think async hooks are necessarily the way, or in the way or form that we'd want them to be forever.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Personally, I haven't had the time or the experience with async hooks to read through the change in detail, so it's hard for me to approve it. But I do have experience with continuation local storage, not necessarily the module, but the general process, and it's a common problem for all of the APM vendors and for some other uses as well. And it's a type of mechanism that needs coordination across the whole node, all of the node ecosystem. And as such, I think it's a feature like it is useful in core. It's a little bit like promises with sorry, not promises, domains. It's also like promises, but like domains, when domains were in core, it was easy to go to modules and say, hey, listen, I know you don't personally think you need domains, but it's hard to track the movement of resources through your module. So we need some kind of solution to this in core, and if Vladimir is working on this, I think it's worthwhile to land it, even if it's experimental. I don't think it does any harm, and then it can be iterated on.
I'm just taking, sorry, a quick note here before I move on. Free PM.
Did you see that Jarish needs re-promotion, Michael?
Doing that. Any other thoughts from people in terms of, you know, is this something that makes sense in core or not? Okay, so I guess you know, it sounds like people haven't necessarily had enough chance to look at it yet. Does it make sense we'll leave it on the agenda and revisit this again next week to see if we can give people time to look at it, think a bit about it, and you know, at that point we'll figure out what the next step is in terms of getting consensus on in core or not, in terms of a general direction.
I guess one question maybe we can answer here are the objections to it objections to the feature itself and its inclusion in Node, or technical objections to its implementation?
No, there's one objection that basically says this shouldn't be in core, from, you know, a collaborator, from one of our collaborators.
From my personal perspective, I wouldn't override any technical objections. Like if there's problems with the implementation itself, if people have problems with the implementation themselves, they should be addressed before it gets landed. But if the only objection is, should this be in core, I would personally be more tempted to override that. That's my personal opinion.
Right, and that's kind of, you know, in line with my thinking as well. We need to get to the consensus on that, since it does look like we need to override that.
And that's the kind of objection that should be dealt with sooner rather than later. There's no point in having the PR open for 4 more months if we're not going to land it.
Right. So I mean, we could, so the ways we could proceed is, one, we could say, well, we can talk to the person who's objecting, because we think we might be able to come to a consensus. I'm not convinced that that will be successful. We could say, let's push it back and have some more discussion and talk about it next week. Or we could say, well, maybe we should have a vote. Or maybe if not a vote, but like you know, we could send through an issue or email or whatever. We could basically, you know, specifically ask all the TSC members to weigh in on their, you know, which way they think it should go.
I honestly don't see why we shouldn't act swiftly on, you know, usually I'm not in favor of that, but this has been open a while. Everybody said what they want to say. And I think it's pretty clear, you know, I think anybody who spends, you know, 20 minutes with this issue, say, is probably going to have an opinion as to whether this should land, it shouldn't land, or, oh my gosh, I'm never going to have an opinion about this.
Okay. So do we want to, I mean, I can basically say, I could send out an email, or we could open an issue basically saying, you know, weigh in on, you know, whether you think it should land in core or not, or you have no opinion. And, you know, if we don't hear from you in a week, we'll assume it's no objection, so there's consensus. Is that reasonable?
I think so. I think just be really clear that you're not asking the TSC. The vote is not an endorsement of the PR as it currently stands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
The only thing the vote is on is if we're overriding that one specific objection.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other issues we can continue the discussion in terms of what the API should look like and that stuff. It would be good if people jumped into the issue and had more comments on that front too. But I think the first step is to get the consensus on, yeah, do we even need to talk about it, because we're making that decision of in or out. So I guess it's most likely I should open an issue that does that and not mention the TSC.
Works for me.
Okay, I'll do that after the meeting. And so with that, we are at the half hour. And actually, no, the social media accounts, sorry, I should mention that's still on the agenda, but we are out of time. So unless somebody had something specific they wanted to talk about, I think we'll defer that to next week. Okay, so at this point, then we will close out the public section, and if everybody can stick around for the HackerOne update, that'd be good. Oh, and I'm going to promote Alec, who's joining us for that, and I'm going to stop